walking through and talking through this feast in the New Testament and the counting of the Omer. The feasts do come up in the New Testament all over the place. When you look at Passover, you see it mentioned, by name specifically many times. And by the way, this list, this handout is not perfect. It's not exhaustive or complete. I had printed it off one time, and there's a few things that I've added to it since then that I missed. So you may have some to add to it. If you think of something, let me know. But you see Passover pops up in multiple places throughout the Gospels, and even is referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If y'all want to turn there, we can just look at that one real quick. We're going to look at a few of these. Sometimes it's named, sometimes it's not. Verse 23 of chapter 11. He talks about, for what I received from the Lord, what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Yeshua, on the night he was betrayed, took matzah, and we had given thanks. He broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in memory of me." In the same way, he also took the cup after supper. And of course, what does that mean? It's which cup in the Seder meal?
Redemption.
It's the third cup, which is the cup of redemption. Right? So he's giving us these notations of when things happen. He says, after the supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in memory of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So what does the Passover declare? The Lord's death. But also it declares what? Until he comes. So it's not just saying it's dead, he's dead and the story's over. There's more to the story that's coming. So at Passover, you see all of those different types of moments, even just mentioned. Unleavened bread. You see that in Matthew. Oh, why is it doing that? In Mark 14, Luke 2, Luke 22, Acts chapter 20, and 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Unleavened bread is mentioned in all of those. Look at the Acts chapter, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 5, since we're already in Corinthians. But in this one, verses 6 through 8, he's using unleavened bread and the concept of what leaven represents, which is, leaven represents sin. He says, "Your boasting is no good. Don't you know that a little chametz leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old chametz so you may be a new batch, just as you are unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover lamb," so that's one that was missing from the previous, "has been sacrificed. Therefore let us celebrate the feast, not with old chametz, the chametz of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of matzah, of sincerity and truth." He's saying that to a bunch of Gentiles. And if they never had unleavened bread, if their diet and their culture never included unleavened bread, would that mean much to them? We, in the American culture, do we typically eat unleavened bread at all?
No.
No. So most of us don't really know what that means and what it looks like until you actually try to eat unleavened bread. And so he's encouraging these Gentiles to eat and do and participate in unleavened bread because it teaches you something about the presence of sin in life and how difficult it is to avoid it. So unleavened bread works with that. First fruits is in Luke 24. You see it in John chapter 20. First fruits is essentially, in 1 Corinthians 15. I meant to go to Acts chapter 20. Let's back up to unleavened bread and look at Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verse 6. This is after Paul is getting in a little trouble now and there. He's coming to Greece. He's spending 3 months there. It says in verse 6, but we sailed from Philippi after what? The days of unleavened bread, the feast of matzah. In 5 days we came to them in Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. All right? So, then there's that next phrase, which we'll get to in a moment, now on the first day of the week. We'll come to that one in just a little bit. But, so Paul and Luke, who's writing the book of Acts, is still marking, even though he's not in the land, even though he's with and traveling around with Paul, he's in the Grecian area, he's around a bunch of Gentiles, but he's still marking time based on the feast and what's going on. Paul is still oriented his life, even though he's not in the land, around the feasts and the practice of it. First fruits come up in Luke chapter 24, John chapter 20, in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20. Well, see, I did it again. How does this one come up? Really, it's in essence, it's in all of the Gospels. So that should show all of the Gospels. But how is first fruits mentioned in all of the Gospels? At the resurrection. Right? That's really what first fruits is all about. It's talking about the power of the resurrection. Look back in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And again, these are passages that we read. We'll come to this one in a little bit. But just the first part of it, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20 says, but now Messiah has been raised from the dead, the what? He is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. All right, so he is describing and talking about the resurrection in terms of first fruits. And he wants his readers, he expects his readers to know and understand that. The counting of the Omer is what's happening now. It's the offering, or the wave offering of such. It's the whole 40 days of Yeshua after the resurrection, up to the 49th day, which is the 7th Shabbat. Those are all the counting of the Omer. This during that time period of that. We'll get there. John chapter 20, verse 26 through 29. Look over there in John chapter 20. Verse 19, John chapter 20, verse 19 says, it was evening on that day, the first day of the week. So it's the same day of resurrection. So that means that it is what day? It's first fruits, right? The doors were locked and Yeshua shows up. All right, then in chapter 26, verse 26 through 29, it says, 8 days later, the disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. So this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread has finished at this point. So they're outside of unleavened bread, but they're still within the time period of the counting of the Omer. They just had the seventh day assembly previously, but they're in that counting of the Omer. Chapter 21. Where it says, after these things, Yeshua revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. Of course, this is all within that 40-day window. So that is all of chapter 21 is happening within everything before he ascends in the book of Acts and such. And before he returns to glory, everything is happening within the counting of the Omer. Acts chapter 1 and 2 are all within the counting of the Omer, leading up to Shavuot, or the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 20, verse 7, where we were just reading a little bit ago, when it talks about the first day of the week, The Greek there is miaton sabbaton, which actually means one of the Sabbaths. So, for years, decades, centuries, they've taken that phrase, first day of the week, as a proof for saying that's how we know that the early church was worshiping on Sunday, right? But that's not what it means. It means one of the Sabbaths, which to an understanding, a Jewish, a Hebraic, biblical understanding, would know that one of the Sabbaths means that they're in the time after unleavened bread, before Shavuot. They're counting of the Omer. One of the 7 Sabbaths between unleavened bread and the Pentecost. So a Jewish audience would know that. We don't, because we don't reckon by that biblical system. Then Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, or what we call Pentecost, is called Pentecost because it's how many days?
50.
It's 50. All right? So that's in Acts chapter 2. There's a lot of 2s apparently here. 2, 2, and 21. But Acts chapter 2, verse 21 through 21. Acts chapter 20, verse 16. You're still... and 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 8. I know I'm just kind of flipping around. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 8 says this. Well, I'll back up a little bit. This is verse 5. This is Paul talking. He says, I will come to you after I've passed through Macedonia, for I am passing through Macedonia. Perhaps I will stay with you, or even spend the winter, so that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to stay on with you for a while, if the Lord permits. But I will stay on at Ephesus until what? Does anybody have that?
Pentecost.
Until Pentecost, which is Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks. For a great door has opened wide for me, though many are in opposition. So again, what is he orienting his life around? The feast. Where is he supposed to be, if possible, for Pentecost? He's supposed to be in Jerusalem. That's one of the traveling feasts. That's one of the pilgrimage feasts. So he's supposed to be in Jerusalem. So I'm going to stay as long as I can until I have to leave to go to Jerusalem for Pentecost. So he is still very much orienting his life around that. The Feast of Trumpets, Matthew chapter 24, and talking about the second coming. If anybody wants to turn there and look at that. Matthew 24, verse 30. Says, Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the land will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a great shofar, a great trumpet, and they will gather together his chosen from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Right? So he is talking about trumpets there. 1 Corinthians 15 mentions that. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 mentions that. And as does Revelation chapter 11, the importance and the significance of the shofar call. All of those are in reference to the importance of the shofar, the calling together of his people, the gathering of his people, which trumpets is all about. Because trumpets is also, you're gathering the people because what's happening? The assembling of the people, because the king is coming. Because the king is going to be crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's why he is gathering all his people. The Day of Atonement, Acts chapter 27, if y'all want to turn there, Acts chapter 27. Helps if you don't pass it. How many of y'all knew you were going to be doing Bible drill today? I don't normally do that. Actually, Acts chapter 27, verse 9. He says, since considerable time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous because the fast had already gone by, Paul kept warning them and telling them, men, I can see that the voyage is about to end in disaster and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. So he's making this reference. It's dangerous because the fast had already gone by. The only feast that has a command about fasting is the Day of Atonement. And for them, that meant a certain time of year where it was dangerous to go out sailing in the Mediterranean because the winds and the storms had shifted. You know, at certain times of the year, we can expect the blizzards and the storms to come our way, right? The same thing for them. They knew after a certain time of year, don't put a whole lot of cargo on a ship and try to sail it anywhere because there's a good chance it's not going to make it. So Acts chapter 27 is there. It's in Hebrews chapter 9. If y'all wanted to flip over there real quick. It talks about the holy place and the ark where the bread is sitting. And beyond the second curtain was a dwelling place, this is verse 3, called the Holy of Holies. It had a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant completely covered with gold, right? All that stuff. He says, verse 6, now with these things prepared this way, the Kohanim do continually enter into the outer tent while completing the services, but into the inner, how many times? Once a year. Right? What day is that he's allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies? The Day of Atonement. Right? He doesn't come out and say that, but if you know the biblical system, the temple system, the system with the tabernacle, then you know what day he's talking about. He's talking about the Day of Atonement. And it's also one of those days, you know, it's between the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, where the tradition is about the books of life being opened, right? But on the Day of Atonement, the book of life is closed. And your name had better be in the book of life when the book is closed. Because if not, that means you're not going to live the next year. Or something to that effect. I'm still a little uncertain on how that ends sometimes. But the Day of Atonement in the Book of Life is a connected concept to the Day of Atonement. It's the judgment. It's a day of judgment where he's separating the sheep and the goats and all those types of things. Tabernacles is talked about in John chapter 7, in Acts chapter 18, and in Revelation chapter 19. Because the tabernacles, the Feast of Tabernacles, is the wedding feast of the Lamb. So again, all of these things are spread all throughout what we call the New Testament. And since we didn't grow up with this calendar, because we didn't grow up with this culture, these things don't necessarily connect to us the way they should. We don't necessarily automatically know what time of year is it. So if we're talking about the Feast of Tabernacles, what time of year are we talking about on our regular calendar?
Fall.
The fall, September, October, right? So we're in that time period. We don't know that without understanding the biblical system. So here we are on all these things. Oh, this is something else. We've talked about this in going through the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John can be organized and read with the understanding about the spring feasts. Right? It is so much built around the feasts. He tells you what time of year it is by telling you what feast it is. In the Gospels in general, we get to see how the spring feasts are fulfilled in his first coming. So, guess where John tells us about the fulfillment of the fall feasts? Does anybody know?
Revelation.
It's in Revelation. That's where we see the fall feast being fulfilled. So Revelation includes a lot of language and imagery from trumpets, from the Day of Atonement, and from tabernacles. And of course, it's the same author of both. Right now, where we're at, we finished with Passover, unleavened bread. The last day was essentially yesterday. We've come through first fruits. Now we're in that period of counting the Omer between first fruits and Pentecost or Shavuot. We're leading to that moment. So that's the time period between there. Deuteronomy verse 16 is the special Torah reading for this week. Okay, and in that whole section, it is kind of recapping all of the feasts and all, not all of them, but some of the major feasts. It's talking about observing the Passover in verses 1 and 2, and then 5 and 7. It's talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread and eating only the matzah in verse 3 and 4 and verse 8. Then look over in, I don't have it here, I guess. Deuteronomy 16. Verse 9 talks about this. It says, 7 weeks you are to count for yourself. From the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain, you will begin to count 7 weeks. Then you will keep the feast of Shavuot, or the feast of weeks, or Pentecost. Right? So, counting of the weeks is 7 Sabbaths long, which is, so those of you who hate to do math, 49 days, 50th day is Pentecost. Okay? So the Feast of First Fruits, which is the day of resurrection, is day 1 of counting of the Omer, and it's representing the first of that year's harvest. It's the first fruits represents the harvest. It represents the provision of God. It represents that in making this offering of just a little bit of the sheaf of your first of the coming ripening harvest, it's representing the fact that you are trusting in Him for your future provision. It's not necessary. It hasn't all been provided yet when you start. That's the important thing. It hasn't all been provided yet, but you know that it's coming. You know that there is a future of that. It has that picture of resurrection. Yeshua was raised on the first fruits. And so today is the first Sabbath in the counting of the Omer. So this is essentially day 7 of that count. So it's the first of the Shabbats. I'm missing something here. Now this is Leviticus 23, verse 9. It says, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, when you have come into the land which I give to you and reap its harvest, then you are to bring the Omer of the first fruits of your harvest to the Kohen, to the priest. He is to wave the Omer before Adonai to be accepted for you. And on the morrow after the Shabbat, the Kohen is to wave it. And of course, we've already read through this. 1 Corinthians 15, talking about it in terms of the resurrection. If Messiah has not been raised, your faith is futile, you're still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Messiah have perished. And if we have hoped in Messiah in this life alone, we are to be pitied more than all people. If we don't have the fulfillment of first fruits, if Yeshua had only died and buried in the tomb, and that was the end of the story, would it be worth our time to continue to believe in Him? No. Because he would be dead just like Buddha, just like Muhammad, just like all the other religious leaders that are out there. None of them conquered death. Only he did. So if we have hoped in Messiah in this life alone, we are to be pitied more than all people. But now, Messiah has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also has come through a man. For as in Adam all die, so also in Messiah will all be made alive. But each in its own order. Messiah, the first fruits, so he's the firstborn, he's the first one from the dead. Then at his coming, those who belong to Messiah. The key for us to experience that is that we have to be in Messiah. If we're not in Messiah, then we don't enjoy the benefit of the Feast of First Fruits. Does that make sense? So Paul, he spoke of the resurrection in these terms of first fruits, and he didn't really feel the need to explain what first fruits was or what it meant. But he expected his readers to be familiar with it, or at least he expected them to be around people who did know what it was. He expected them to be around people who could explain it to them. And again, he's writing 1 Corinthians to Gentiles. But he doesn't go through and give an exposition of what does first fruits, where does it come from, what does it mean, how do we celebrate that. He's just assuming they know it, or will be able to talk to people who do. So again, first fruits is day 1, we're on day 7, there's 49 total, then there is, so 7 Sabbaths, then there is a celebration, a feast on the 50th day. That's, did I have this in here twice? I guess I have this in here twice. Well, this is verse 15. You are to count from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the Omer of the wave offering, 7 complete Shabbatot. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you are to count 50 days, and then present a new grain offering to Adonai. You are to bring out of your houses 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering, made of 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour. They are to be baked with chametz as first fruits to Adonai. So you're not in unleavened bread anymore, so it's okay to make it with leaven. This is not a feast about the haste or about the judgment or about the trying to get out of there at Passover. This is a feast of rejoicing and celebration at his provision. Does that make sense? So the purpose of the counting of the Omer, let's see, 7 weeks you are to count for yourself. From the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain, you'll begin to count 7 weeks. Then you will keep the feast of Shavuot to Adonai your God, with a measure of a freewill offering from your hand, which you are to give according to how Adonai your God blesses you. The purpose of all of that, leading up to Shavuot, is so you will rejoice before Adonai. The counting of the Omer is to help people rejoice, to help us recognize the ongoing blessing of God, the ongoing provision of God, with an everyday reminder that all that we have is a provision of Him. All that we have is a blessing from Him. It's we pray about in the model prayer, give us this day our daily bread. That's a hearkening back to the manna in the wilderness. But it's also one of those things that the Omer count is also supposed to remind us about. It's a daily bread, demonstrates their trust in God to provide for every day, not just the day that they're on, but every day to come in the future. There is a future harvest that is there because everything comes from Him. You will rejoice before Adonai your God in the place Adonai your God chooses to make his name dwell. You, your son and daughter, slave and maid, Levite and outsider, orphan and widow in your midst. You will remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you are to take care and do these statutes. Who's included in this festival?
Widow, the foreigner, the stranger.
Is anybody supposed to be left out?
No.
This is not for you, right? You're not supposed to do this. Is there anybody? Or is it everybody? You, your family, your servants, the Levite, the outsider, even those that don't have anybody else. They're supposed to be included. Even the ones that you don't think are a part of who you are, the outsider, you're supposed to allow them to rejoice in all of these things. So then you look at all of this stuff, especially with the counting of the Omer, and there's a lot of elements to it. 7 is the number of completion, of perfection and rest, right? What else is the number 7 tied to?
The menorah.
It's tied to the menorah, okay, with the 7 candles.
Judgment.
It's tied to judgment. How so? That's a new one on me.
Revelation.
Well, the seven churches, yeah. But 7 bowls, yeah.
Days of the week.
It's also tied to the Shemitah cycle. It's tied to creation, which the Shemitah means about the release of the debts and the land. So this is just real quick. 8 is talking about new beginnings. There's the 8 steps in creation. There's 8 times that the Genesis story says, the let there be, where there's these actions of creation. There are 8 people on the ark. There's a circumcision on the 8th day. There's the 8th day assembly after tabernacles. It's also, so the idea of new covenant and such. There are 8 things to dwell on in Philippians chapter 4. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any virtue, if there's anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. So it's that idea of reorienting and changing your mind to be thinking on something new. Testimony, the number 10 is the testimony, as a law and responsibility. It's a kind of a completion of the divine order of such. You have the 10 words of the commandments. There's also 10 times in Genesis chapter 1 where it says, and God said. So we get to these things. We have 40 days, or the number 40 is talking about probation, trials, or testing. Noah it was raining for how many days and nights, or at least the way it's typically talked about is 40. Yeshua was in the wilderness for 40 days. Yeshua was here on the earth after the resurrection for how long? 40 days, right?
Children were wandering.
They were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The only thing I could find, and there's probably some more to it than this, but the only thing I could find, so if you have 7 Sabbaths is 49 days, and it's that idea, it carries with it the idea of preservation, which leads to 50, which we understand as Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit and such. But it's also, 50 is also a reference to the year of Jubilee. The idea of freedom, of return, where things are returned to you or returned to the state that it had been in previously. Land was not supposed to be sold forever. It was supposed to, at the 50th year, be given back to whom, so it would stay in the family to whom the inheritance belonged. It's also tied to the giving of the Torah, with Moses on Mount Sinai, the giving of the Torah on stone, but also with the Holy Spirit in the sense of the Torah is now written on our heart. And that's in Ezekiel 36 and Acts chapter 2. And of course the parallel there is at Mount Sinai when Moses came down, 3,000 were killed. But when the Holy Spirit came down on Pentecost, on Shavuot, about 3,000 were saved and added to their number. So all of these are significant. You know, they mean things which in ways that we don't always understand them. You know, the 7 in the Shemitah cycle where there's supposed to be that sense of rest, that's Hebrews talks about the entering into the Sabbath rest that is to come. We're still waiting for things to fully come to fruition for the rest that He has provided. You look at the number of years that the Jewish calendar counts. You know, it's like we are, of course I don't think it's entirely exactly where it's supposed to be, but from the time of creation, it's been over 6,000 years, right? When you look at those numbers, we're approaching somehow or another the 7th thousand, which is what we would call the millennial reign, the reign of 1,000 years. So there's so many things that these are supposed to be representing. And so this cycle, this day of Pentecost is representing the year of Jubilee. It's representing this time of freedom. It's representing all of those things. You know, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the giving of the Spirit at Pentecost was supposed to usher in this walking in holiness. It's supposed to represent this freedom that we have in obeying God and His commandments. Our life is supposed to be better because we have His commandments, isn't it? Isn't our life supposed to be better when we walk in His ways? And yet so many times we've been taught that we are under the law. If you're under the law, that's a bad thing. Well, to be under the penalty and the curse of the law, yes, because the wages of sin is death. But He has come that we might have life. And if there is blessing for disobeying the Torah, there is a curse for disobeying the Torah, thank you, but there is blessing when we obey it. It's intended always to bring life to His people. And when we have them, when we are in that counting of the Omer, you know, we're experiencing, we're thinking about that provision of God. We're thinking about the increase and the promise of the future harvest, which the fall feasts talk about. We're talking about the abundance of God. I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And it's that cup overflowing that Psalm 23 talks about. All of these feasts that we read about and see in the New Testament are supposed to remind us of all of these things. And supposed to get us anticipating what God is doing now in our day, in our life right now, but also in what He is going to do and what He has promised He will fulfill later in the future. Does that make sense? So when people say those feasts and those things don't matter, they're not for you, or you don't need those because we have Messiah. Is it true that we have Messiah? Yes. But those feasts are fulfilled in Him and only make sense in Him. And they actually make a whole lot more sense in keeping them now that we've seen the partial fulfillment, now that we know that there is more fulfillment to come. And it helps prepare us to rejoice in all that He is doing.